Because that was the best.
You want to see it? Yeah.
Good to see you again.
I just had a great session with Gary Hoffman. He's one of our great jazz guys in town. He's a really fabulous quartet. Were you guys there?
I was not there. I missed it. I was not there. Can you go back and watch it, or was it just?
I didn't know. Probably not.
I'm going to borrow your microphone for just a second.
Veronica came.
Everybody, thank you so much for your patience. Thank you, Atlanta Traffic and Philadelphia Airport, for conspiring and proving our capacity for improvisation, right? So just a special welcome to the people who are live streaming. You can wave hi up to the camera up there. I am so grateful that you guys are joining us. My name is Helen Blyer. I serve here as the director of the Center for Lifelong Learning at Columbia Theological Seminary. And tonight you're going to have the chance to eavesdrop on a very special conversation between two long-standing friends. But before we get into that, Bill, if you could hold my microphone for a moment. This was my gift. I will wear it proudly all weekend. So we're going to hear a conversation between two long-standing friends. We've got the Reverend Bill Carter over here, who's the pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Clark Summit, Pennsylvania, and the band leader of Bill Carter and the Presby Bop Quartet. And then we've got Professor Don Saliers, the William R. Cannon Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Theology and Worship at Candler School of Theology, and one of my professors from graduate school. But we were both like prodigies back then. Like, I think we were 6. Yeah, we were like 6. I've known Bill for about a decade. We were introduced by a very wise mutual friend, and Don, of course, I knew way too many years ago at Emory. And bringing them together tonight was Bill's suggestion, since he's in town to do some events for us and for Shallowford Center for Mindful Living. Shout out to Kay Stewart, who is over here, my planning partner for this weekend of events. It was a brilliant suggestion on Bill's part. We're in for a treat as they talk about their shared love for music and how they experience God's presence through listening, writing, and performing it. So I'm going to go sit and enjoy myself.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Don. It's been a couple of years. We were last at Yale Institute of Sacred Music. So Don was actually the mentor for a congregational program that a team from my church had put together on jazz and healing worship services, which were necessarily unscripted. They were planned, but you never knew what was going to happen, just kind of like the work of the Holy Spirit. And we had met before that, actually,
yes,
at a festival of homiletics.
Homiletics Festival.
I think I introduced Tom Long.
Who's well known here.
Mm-hmm. And it was right after his wedding to Kim. And I think the line was something like, I asked Kim, what's it like to be married to the world's greatest preacher? And she said, he's getting used to it. Yeah. And on we went. Yeah. So Don, we have this gift in common. How did the gift of music find you? And how did you cultivate that?
My daddy was a New York jazz musician. In another generation. He played with the Dorseys, was with Paul Whiteman for a while. And like so many New York musicians of the time, had a problem. had a drinking problem. And so alcohol was his lubrication, and it drove him out of New York back to a little town in Ohio where I was born. But I grew up around jazz because later on, when he gained his sobriety, and that's another whole story, I started playing in his dance band. So I would hitchhike home from college at Ohio Wesleyan and earn $9 on the weekend. And sometimes we'd play past midnight, I'd earn $12. Those were big weekends. Anyway, so the music, the jazz side of my life came from my dad. But before that, I grew up around music. His sister, with whom I lived for a while, was a choir director and a soprano. So I would accompany her at times, and then I became the town musician, playing in all the churches. And so I grew up having to know what a congregation would sing and when they were ready to improvise and when they didn't want to tolerate anything except the notes that are written in the book that we've always sung. So I grew up as a musician, piano, violin, clarinet, saxophone. Those were my father's instruments too. So that's how it all got launched, anyway.
Wow. Well, so obviously we start talking music and we're talking narrativity.
So we are.
We start telling stories.
There are stories.
Yeah, my mother was an all-state clarinetist in Pennsylvania.
I wondered about that.
Yeah, and Dad couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. But she still kept her clarinet, and she regaled me with tales. When she was 19, one of my favorite stories is her aunt invited her to a concert for her 19th birthday, and they sat in the balcony of the Latonia Theater in Oil City, Pennsylvania, and they heard Louis Armstrong. And she remembered two things. One was he had a stack of handkerchiefs, and within 30 seconds he was wiping his brow and dropping them. He was so deeply engaged in the music making. And I said, Mom, you know what that B&A would be worth? And the other thing she said was, the room changed. And I said, what do you mean? The room changed. Now this was 1954, I think, 54, 55, seminal years in race relationships in America.
Yes, for sure.
In a town that was a sundown town, which meant Lewis and the band had to sleep somewhere else that night. And I had no idea when I began to kind of chase the narrative, our own broken narrative as a nation and how that kind of wove into the music making. And yet, the room changed. There was an embrace of transcendence with a room that was probably all white, except for those on stage. And so I've been trying to mine that a little bit. I was a terrible piano student, never practiced. Loved it. There was always music, 45s of Fats Waller and Glenn Miller in the background. But then I heard ragtime, and as I've explained to a couple of my piano students, it went from being externally imposed, you must practice 30 minutes with the kitchen timer, to internally driven. I'm going to set the timer for 30 minutes to get you to stop. Because, and I think that's that critical move that happens with all of the arts, and even with theology, is when it bites you, you've got to go with it. You've got to go with it. So tell us how you went with it. How did you develop that gift?
Well, I had a small town good piano teacher who allowed me to play duets with her and so on. So it was encouragement from people who knew what they were doing. And I remember, you know, our lives as musicians, they're marked by hearing certain people For example, I was giving a lecture in Vancouver, and a guy says, "Come on, we're going to go hear a good piano player." I said, "Okay, all right. Some wild Canadian or something, I don't know." It was Errol Garner. And once you hear Errol, you can't get over how he plays that way. And yet, he has a very distinctive style. You can't quite duplicate what he does. And so I think a series of good musical experiences, of course with my father and playing in a dance band, although my style was not his style. If any of you have ever heard of Guy Lombardo, that was my father's era and style. And so I would take off on a solo. I remember we were playing a country club, and I took off on a solo on Take My Hand, I'm a Stranger in Paradise, which of course has a good classical background to it, you know. And at halftime, he said, "Son, just cool the progressive stuff." That's right. He was noticing people weren't dancing to it. They were listening and so on. But what you do is, this is your life too. You hear good musicians, and we're speaking specifically now of jazz musicians, and you can't go home again. You can't go home again. I was just listening to Chick Corea's trio on the way over here, and he has a way of playing extraordinarily Baroque stuff. And then he settles in, and you hear what he's trying to play. But it takes a lot of experience with these good musicians to understand just how broad and how deep jazz is, and how much it owes to classical training.
Exactly. And in fact, Chick and Keith Jarrett played the Mozart double piano concerto in Tokyo. Little known fact. Because they could.
I can believe it.
Yeah, well, my hometown in upstate New York had a public endowment that would bring in a big band every year. So we heard Woody Herman, and we heard Stan Kenton, we heard Maynard Ferguson before he went electric. We heard, I think, Count Basie. That was probably when I was young. And of course, once you hear Basie, you want to keep hearing him. And there was just something infectious and alive at the heart of this. And it raised the question for me that it took 30 more years to figure out how to ask, which is, where does this come from? And it does not come from dots on a piece of paper. There's something behind it and beneath it, and even within it, that for me has become an act of the Holy Spirit.
Some of you here got some good friends here, and know that I just finished a book on the Psalms, or it finished me, actually. And it'll be coming out next year. Westminster, good publisher. But I was thinking about the relationship between the Psalms and jazz. And you got to start with the blues. There ain't no psalms that don't have blues in it. The laments and the praise require each other, and so I've been thinking a lot about musicians that take the psalms on musically. And we know some popular versions. Bono, for example, that's a great example of someone, a musician who is steeped in the Psalms. But then you have to start thinking about people like Lenny Bernstein and Stravinsky, for that matter. And so how the emotional range of the Psalms finds its way immediately into jazz because of the oral traditions of lament. It prays too, but lament first. So I've been thinking a lot about that, how the church itself inherits a sound, a feel through ordered sound.
Well, and for me, I raised the question, why didn't I ever learn, or was I never taught, the 2/3 of the Psalms that complain? I was taught the happy ones. I was taught the C major chord ones, the ones that were already resolved. And if we ever dared to hear, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Someone always pointed out, well, it turns around at the end, you know. That, yeah, well, that, and I realized later that was probably added. But the question of how do we give voice to our full humanity, musically as well as textually?
And that's where jazz comes in, because, I mean, there certainly there's music. I had a sandwich at Panera. Terrible, insipid music. Did you? Yeah. And they always play it at the end, and you say, "Oh my God, shut it off." Anyway. But you know, once you have heard a Fats Waller, my Methodist bishop's name was Ammons, Edmund Ammons. And if you know your history, you know, a jazz musician came out of that family. So I'm always looking for these connections between theology, the church, and jazz. But jazz as a language that allows us to weep and cry without ceasing, but also allows us to get on our feet and not stop. And I think all of those analogies between the spiritual life, between our life, and what jazz brings to us, and the people in jazz. You mentioned Maynard Ferguson. You know, all the dogs in the world are barking after Maynard plays. You've ever heard Stan Kent? And Maynard would cut loose on a chorus, and I'd say all the dogs in Christendom were woo with him. Yeah. So the emotional range of music is one thing. The emotional range of jazz intensifies that. I really do think that's true.
It does, and there are so many dimensions of this. Is religion, the practice of faith, the spiritual life, an act of conforming to some resolved standard? Or is it a response to some spiritual presence within us that awakens us and directs us to honest expression and the building of community, which is a really difficult thing to do. We would prefer to sit with people who are just like us. But to find music that's an appropriate soundtrack for that voices it, that coalesces the sense of community, and yet is honest. You know, I lament and I worry after now 40 years in the pastorate about those churches that are trying to manage the emotional results of their preaching. They try to tie it all together as if the spiritual life can be tied together. I mean, the Psalms don't get tied together until you get to the back of the hymnal and you've got the 5 Hallel Psalms at the end. Praise, 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 praise. Yeah, I know.
The Psalms are in there, and they're disguised.
And they're disguised.
Disguised as hymns, choruses, whatever. But you hear this other music that is beyond just the standard stuff.
Right.
I mean, it's there waiting. Kind of, I think of it. The Psalms themselves lie in wait for us, like good jazz does. And then you hear someone. I mean, I think of, there's just so many we could start naming, and you could name the names, and in your mind, in your heart, you hear a peculiar kind of configuration of sounds. And sometimes it's the texture of the music. Sometimes it's the rhythm that you can't get out of your head. Sometimes it's just the sheer improvisational skill on what you thought was a melody that you knew, and then the melody completely is transformed. You are transformed.
I'm thinking of John Coltrane.
Oh, yeah.
Whose two grandparents were AME preachers. He was raised within the embrace of the church. His spiritual path kind of gave that credence, but then kind of even moved beyond just pure Christianity. One of his pieces at the Village Vanguard in 1961 was called Spiritual. It was just listed as spiritual. And they asked the band, so like, what's this song? Because it starts kind of, it's a chant, and then it goes into a 6/8 thing, C minor, F7, C minor, F7. And what they found out is he had found this in an early African-American hymnal. No one knows the trouble I've seen. It was the alternate version of the melody before it got, sanitized. Yeah, sanitized. And he just lets loose for 10, 12 minutes on this. Now, he didn't make a big thing of that. His record company was a little nervous, I think, about putting the title of the hymn on the back of an album because that might affect sales. So you got the politics of economics in the thick of this too, the music making, and someone's got to buy and sell it. But the pure expression of Coltrane on his soprano sax, just reaching for the infinite and then blessing the people who had ears to hear.
No accident that one of his great compositions is Love. Love Supreme.
Right.
And we sometimes fuss about the relationship between jazz sounds and human sensibilities. But I do believe there is transcendence available to us, and not just in classical music, but I think of some of those things that Coltrane did, or for that matter, one of my favorite pianists. I don't know what your favorite pianists are. Is Bill?
Bill Evans?
Yeah, Bill Evans. I was going to say is Bill.
Bill Evans.
And isn't it? He can break your heart. And all he needs is a few flatted ninths, or just simply a melody line with the simplest of elements behind it. What is that? What is that?
It's a cultivated artistry. With Bill Evans, he would play a C minor chord. He might have a C and a G in his left hand, and then a D natural, E flat, and B flat. So there was some texture to it. And then he was, he could sight read Rachmaninoff. Again, he had the goods. But he could get around on the piano, and he could move that chord voicing around and then delicately resolve it.
Can you give us an example?
Oh, sure. So,
this is unrehearsed, guys.
Let's see. That chord would be like this. But my favorite version, my favorite piece is I was mulling over my call to ministry. Actually, I was mulling over being dumped by a college girlfriend. It kind of coincided at the same time, and I went to the record co-op. That was back when vinyl was available before it came back at 5 times the price. And I picked up a Bill Evans album, and he played this tune when I fall in love, it will be forever, or I'll never fall in love. Now here's the thing. I did a little exegesis and discovered when he recorded that, he was a couple years into a serious heroin addiction that he never totally outran. I mean, he gave it up, he took up something else, but he was a very complicated human being. And yet, in the moment, he's reaching for.
And that story can be told over and over and over. In my own biography, my own story about my father's addiction. Sometimes he played against it. Sometimes it prohibited him from playing. And then there were times when I thought, he's what's coming out of a guy who's diminished by this disease. And that always has remained a marvel to me. And that can be said. Of course, there were so many in New York at the time my dad was playing in New York.
Well, and in the 40s and 50s, they've now uncovered that organized crime in New York and environments were flooding African American communities with heroin, making it available and inexpensive. And again, it was another form of Jim Crow. And yet, in the thick of that, honesty is proclaimed, pain is voiced, redemption is revealed. Faintly, but it's there.
Pain, redemption, lament, and praise. Those ranges that human beings are capable of, I think, is one of the reasons why many of us love to hear a good jazz musician.
Right.
Who knows what she's doing.
That's right.
Marion McPartland. I mean, you can say the names over and over and over again.
My friend Deanna Witkowski, who just got her her PhD in Mary Lou Williams. Another force.
A pretty good degree.
It's a pretty
PhD in Mary Lou Williams.
PhD in Mary Lou Williams. So here's the question. I mean, make the little spiritual connection with the communities of faith that we know all too well, where everything is relatively scripted. I think of a conference I took part in years ago. Every line that was voiced was written down so that we could kind of get through all this. And of course, every service had to last 59 and a half minutes.
Yeah, oh, sure. Ichabod. It's the spirit departs if it's 59.
Right, that's right. That's right. Actually, with my buddies playing jazz, the spirit's just starting to cook at 59 and a half minutes. Yeah, but it's that whole, I think some of this is cultural, some of this is our traditions of ecclesiology, is the notion of control. Control. And I mean, control gives comfort, control provides resolution, control keeps clergy employed, or so they think, but it also can wither, it can also damage, it can also push open the latent cracks that are in that soul. And unfortunately, if there's no place for lament, no place for spaciousness, no place for the Jesus who says, I have many things yet to say to you, but you can't bear to hear them yet. Oh my God, you have more things to say to us? There's a future to this? How do we bring such a sensibility into our worship gatherings? I admit I get energized by gospel music and services, even though I am latently Presbyterian. And my sermons are four pages of 14-point font with half-inch margins, single-spaced. It's 18 minutes, 2,200 words. That's what I preach.
Well, let me ask you this. I've heard you play. Those of us who've had a chance to hear you in your band, when you're preaching, are you ever tempted to let it go and just improvise, riff?
Wow, you're asking a firstborn child of an IBM engineer. Yeah. But improvisation is not pulling notes out of the air. It's digging them out of the compost heap. Absolutely. And there's a difference to that, because if you have to do your work off stage. You got to learn your music. You have to learn how to work with others. You need to learn tunes. You need to wake your way around your instruments. It's the same thing with a preacher. I mean,
all right, you have heard it here. In the heart of Presbyterianism, improvisation in preaching is crucial.
Yeah.
And I hear tell that Jesus did this.
Well, what is it? It is listening to the Spirit call the text into the future. It's not giving a book report. A book report is kind of sticking to what the scribes and Pharisees always said. And Jesus stands up and says, let me give you the text and say, today is the day. And of course they want to kill him. Among other things. But he's bringing the text to here and now and letting people know the full dynamic of that. And again, most of those who preach, myself included, have a canon of maybe 4 or 5 or 10 extra favorite books of the Bible.
That's prodigious if you have a canon.
Yeah, I know.
We're used to 2. But no, I've often thought that those scripture passages where Jesus says, you have heard it said of old, I say to you, that kind of improvisation of the Spirit is just indigenous.
And it's rooted in the tradition. It's rooted in the tradition, but it brings the tradition forward, which takes work and imagination. So, which reminds me, do you know who Dave Brubeck's favorite musician was?
Oh dear, I should know this, but no. Is it Bach?
Johann Sebastian Bach.
I mean, you want to talk about improvisation and so on. And we forget that there's a whole period of classical music in which we talk about figured bass. I don't know if any of you have been in groups where the score is written there, but it's written in numbers. So you're really called upon to improvise on the harmonic structures. It's there. So it's been in music, riding along underneath all along, and so that these, the discovery of the flatted ninth, that's as important as I was going to make some.
They need to hear what that is.
Yeah, play it for the flatted ninth.
Human abilities or human gifts that help facilitate that. A connection between the ear and the finger, hopefully through the heart.
Yes.
But it's not playing by ear, which is kind of a rare and somewhat freakish gift, but it's playing with your ears wide open and then hearing the relationships, the constellations that come together between the notes. And a lot of the great composers, just like the great improvisers, improvisation is simply instantaneous composition. That's all it is, same process. But they could hear this. They could hear this. They could perceive things, and some of them would develop to a point they could write down notes apart from their instruments.
Wolfie did it all the time.
That's right.
Mozart will sit down and astonish people by what he heard and could then translate.
Last 15 minutes of the movie Amadeus. He's dictating his mass from a sickbed.
Yeah. Have any of you seen the film Amadeus? It's an old film.
Old films, but yeah, to be able to kind of connect what you hear with what you create. But the pedagogy doesn't often function that way. You sit at the piano, you have the proper posture, you look at the black dots, you translate them into what your fingers are doing, and then you go and hear a jazz band and they don't have paper on the stage. Like, what is this? Well, they're making music. They're not replicating the notes. You want to comment on that as a practitioner of Bach's music?
Yeah. Well, any of you have ever taken an instrument that, say, start with the piano, but they'd be all other instruments. There is that time when your teacher says, that's a mistake. Well, jazz is one long mistake. It's playing the wrong notes in the right place, and suddenly you've got extraordinary people.
That's right. And learning what to do with the mistake. You know, when I'm at Shallowford, I'll tell them a story about Herbie Hancock laid the absolute wrong chord when he was playing one night with Miles Davis. He told the story at Harvard in some lectures, and Miles looked at him, and then played some notes, as Herbie said in his Buddhist sensitivity, turned my poison into medicine. Yeah. And it just made the chords sound right. And Miles said, it's not a mistake yet, it's what you do after the mistake that matters. Do you resolve it? Do you push it forward? Do you take it somewhere else?
Yeah, it's Bobby McFerrin does everything. You know Bobby McFerrin's work. He'll do that and take off into uses of the voice that you would say, oh, I don't know, there's a problem there. And then he'll get 100 people, 1,000 people in a room to go with it. Right. Go with it. And there's something about that that's so exhilarating.
It is. It is. I took a sabbatical in 2013 with some Lilly drug money, and found myself on the Hudson River at a conference center with Bobby McFerrin and 150 of his closest friends. And so his health now is not strong enough to do this in a big sense, but he would break us in 4 parts, SATB, and he would start an ostinato.
Just start it.
Yeah, just start it. Ba-ba-doo, ba-ba-doo, ba-ya-boo, ba-ba-doo, ba-ba-doo, ba-doo, ba-ba-doo. And so the basses would pick that up, and he'd get that going, and then a counter line with the tenors, and they'd come back and they'd do something else. And then the altos would do something else, and sopranos, he'd have them break into triads and do kind of horn punctuations. And he'd get this thing going, and then he'd beckon you out and give you a microphone. And have you improvise. And each tune, if you would, went about 20 minutes. And the endorphins in the room were like,
You could see the endorphins.
and we're up in the air, and this lady pulled me aside and says, you're Reverend, right? I said, yeah. She said, you've been outed. I said, okay. She said, I'm an atheist, and this is the most spiritual thing I know.
That's no accident that people who
Yeah.
aren't in the church and aren't bothered by religion can hear things in some of that music.
Well, it was wild. I turned around that first night, the guy behind me, bald guy, I said, excuse me, are you Tony 11? He says, well, yeah. Now, who's Tony 11? Well, he was Chuck Mangione's first bass player at Eastman when Chuck got started out. He now plays bass with some guy named Peter Gabriel. And on the hit Sledgehammer, he's laying down the line on his five-string bass. And he said, so we're in Montreux on stage, and Peter's rocking the house, and somebody says, hey, Peter, Bobby McFerrin's here. Let's call him up. No, we got our thing. You know, we've practiced this. Well, the band prevailed, and so for the last tune, which was Sledgehammer, he calls him up. Bobby jumps up, matches Peter's phrasing exactly, then takes it up a third, and then reharmonizes the tune on stage, and the crowd goes crazy. And Peter's, yeah, Bobby McFerrin, don't come back.
Well, of course, my training, my musical training has been mostly classical. As I say, I've had the benefit of a father in the jazz world. I had a trio when I was in high school. We called, I blush now to think of it. But we called Three Guys Named Mo. How about that?
There you go.
Original. But we would play and do these things. But I think of what happens when people really discover the connection between the classical musicians and what you have to know in order to play well. Not because you know all the scores and have read all the music and can play in C sharp minor, although some can, without thinking. But that you bring in the resources, the musical resources, rhythm, texture, harmony, counterpoint. And some of the best jazz is when people are on each other's wavelengths in different instruments. So 4-bar breaks, for example. If you listen much, the 4-bar break is a very famous emergence. Why don't you say in the 40s?
Even before that, Louis Armstrong picked it up, probably from Buddy Bolden, who was a Baptist cornet player. But Louis would put together music that then Jelly Roll Morton would take credit for 20 years later. But they would kind of ba-ba-doop and ba-ba-doop boom boom da ba-ba-doop and doop ba-da boom ba break. Ba-ba-dee ba-ba-doop ba-ba-doop ba-da ba-ba-doop ba-ba-doop ba-da boom boom band ba-ba-doop ba-dee-ba-doop.
Drums.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And you know, my wife still asks, how come everybody takes a turn?
Oh,
I said,
good.
just to make the music go longer.
How come everyone gets a turn? Now that's another whole side of jazz that's worth talking about.
It's democracy and action.
It's a democratic form, and when you see that going, when you hear that going with really good players, I mean your band does this.
We do.
And there's something about that. It's a conversation.
Exactly.
Jazz is full of conversations.
Exactly.
And they can be very sad conversations. Billie Holiday, for God's sake. And on the other side of it, take scat singing, take Ella Fitzgerald. And she has conversations with herself.
She does.
So, okay.
I'm curious as we're talking about the relationship between classical and jazz, and you talk about your background of as a jazz father and being played in the church. When you mentioned Errol Garner, you talked about someone self-taught. So I'm wondering what you learned from self-taught musicians that primarily were not oriented from classical, but oriented because of their superb capacity to hear.
It's a great question. What do you learn from self-taught musicians?
Yes.
Just repeated in the mic.
Yeah.
You know, Errol Garner's his video biography is titled "No One Can Hear You Read." They can hear you play.
That's good.
Okay, and I mean, and just to watch the old videos of him with those little dinky hands sitting on 2 city phone books that he traveled with in a suitcase, and looking at the stage and kind of working the crowd, and not looking at his hands, and they were flying. I think one answer is jazz, as with any authentic music, begins as folk music. There's something here from the folks. That's how my old buddy Drew Beck would say. Is there something here that resonates with human experience that then gets voiced and played back into the. That's one piece. And then later on, you figure out how to write it down. I mean, part of my shtick on the songs is you open up your Bible to the middle, and you see a bunch of songs that have lost their tunes. And now the call on every generation is how to reanimate those texts, the melodies and rhythms.
And there's some things that you can't notate.
Exactly, and it could back then. It was all traditions. You know, the Levites, I'm sure, heard one another, copied one another, modeled one another. But there's a problem with notation. It's limited, and you can't catch it all. And I think for me, I was sitting in the chapel at Princeton Seminary listening to, I just blanked on her She wrote music with Robert Shaw. Alice.
Oh, Alice Parker. Alice.
She holds up a blue Presbyterian hymnal to her ear and says, "But I can't hear anything." Make the point.
She was a great one.
We have to make the music. And the writing then comes later as a way of reproducing or collecting it. Yeah.
So I have a question in regards to, you talked about the democracy in the jazz band. In that particular genre, I notice as different musicians are taking their turns with their solos, the percussionist comes last. In some other genres of music, the drums, maybe the snares,
Right.
start. So can you make some comment about that?
Our drummer's down the hall. He probably could. Different musicians tend to have different senses of their own ability. Wynton Marsalis said one time, "I play the trumpet in order to be heard." I think drums again has to be the culture. Music that emerges from Africa. It's layers of drums. I mean, who needs a note if you have drums? In jazz, it really depends on the band. It depends on their kind of assumptions of what's going to happen. We always like to end a concert with a big drum solo. Like we're afraid to let him do that too early in the evening. Because you'll peak. So, what do you think?
Do you know there's a whole set of folk masses? Missaluba, for example, is an African mass. Or Missa Criolla is an Argentinian mass. And they're characterized by using indigenous rhythmic patterns. Dances that are part of the cultural body rhythm. And those are really interesting to hear because the most predominant notion is the rhythmic one, to which is added and layered then vocalizations and so on. But I think that business of the drummer starting, and then we know, of course, that the drummers speak. The drummers have a language. There are cultures in which drumming itself is a language. So when jazz comes together, it's pulling these deep things that are already in human beings together in some ways. And then there are the really sophisticated things that happens, say with Brubeck, when Joe Morello was playing with Brubeck. I don't know if you know the classical Brubeck stuff. Joe Morello was, of course, the great sax player was there, but it was Joe Morello who often sort of gave the structural keys and clues as to the breaks, but also to how they play. And then Paul Desmond would, in that wonderful lyrical sax of his, would pick up rhythms from Morello, so the drum leads. And that's the other genius here. So you can go back and forth between instruments. And then if you get to an Ella Fitzgerald, she's a whole orchestra. And so I think that's another of the fascinating things about the history of jazz.
Well,
it's constant evolutionary form.
And it's understanding too that it comes from, it's multicultural music. You know, it did not only begin in New Orleans, which is a multicultural city. It was firing up like a candelabra in a variety of places in the late 1800s. A colleague of ours who's a saxophonist got some money out of the Doris Duke Family Foundation, went to Haiti with a recording device and heard voodoo drum ceremonies. Then came back and tried to notate them and almost drove himself insane because the levels of complexity with the drums in like 15/8 and they're accenting beat 3 and 7 and 11 and playing over top of that. It was more than he could handle. And then he figured some of it out, and he wrote jazz melodies to it and gave it to a band of white guys, and it did not work. They just weren't that sophisticated. I mean, it's extraordinary what we have to learn from one another, but unfortunately, we're running out of time. At least officially. I'm around all weekend.
We're running out of time for Cameron, for Jeff, so can you join me in thanking these one of the jazz musicians getting together is that it's just all storytelling. And the riffs and the movement back and forth as the stories are built on, you draw from the past and bringing it into the present. You're going to hear that musically tomorrow if you come join us. We have our worship at 10:10 tomorrow, and Bill and the entire Presbypop Quartet will be doing music, and Bill will be preaching, yes, for the service. And then in the afternoon, we have a leadership seminar where he's going to be talking about jazz for teachers, preachers, and other servants of grace. And then a concert in the evening here. Everything's here in the chapel, 7 o'clock. So please come join us for more. And again, for those of you who are online, thank you for joining us. We'll officially end the live stream now and hang out a little bit for folks who are here to continue the conversation. But thank you.